While walking through his mansion's garden, a millionaire is stunned to hear the gardener singing a song. The same one his wife sang to their son before disappearing 20 years ago. The sun's rays filtered through the leaves of the ancient oak surrounding George Parker's Hampton estate. The crisp morning air carried the scent of freshly cut grass, mingling with the salt from the distant ocean. George walked slowly, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel path. He had long ago perfected the art of walking with purpose while being mentally detached from the world. Today was no different, or so he thought, as he strolled past the rose garden that his wife, Natalie, had adored. His gaze hardened. The vibrant reds and soft pinks of the roses were a cruel reminder of what he had lost. Memories fought their way into his consciousness. Her laughter, the way her eyes sparkled when she looked at him, the tiny, joyful giggles of their son, Joshua. Memories that he spent 2 decades trying to bury under piles of contracts, business deals, and late-night board meetings. All the money and power in the world couldn't erase the hollow ache in his chest. He paused, his hand brushing absent-mindedly over a delicate white rose. It was blooming in the exact spot where Natalie had planted it the year before she disappeared. A lump formed in his throat. Grief, cold and familiar, wrapped around his heart. Then, a sound broke through his thoughts. A tune, a soft, wistful melody that floated through the air. George froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The world blurred around him, and for a brief moment, he was no longer standing in his garden. He was in Joshua's bedroom, watching Natalie tuck their son into bed. Her voice, sweet and gentle, hummed that very same lullaby. The melody lingered, delicate yet insistent. He turned sharply, eyes narrowing. The sound was coming from a young man bent over a flower bed, a watering can in hand. He was whistling as he worked, oblivious to the tremor he'd just sent through George's world. George's throat tightened. Who was this kid? And why did he know that song? Composing himself, George approached the young man. His footsteps were quick and determined, his face a mask of composure. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low but firm. The young man straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans. He had tousled dark hair, sharp green eyes, and an easy, boyish smile that faltered when he saw George's stern expression. "Good morning, Mr. Parker. Is there something I can help you with?" George's gaze lingered on the boy's features. There was something unsettlingly familiar about the curve of his jaw, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. George cleared his throat, trying to mask the unease bubbling inside him. "What's your name?" "Jonathan," the boy replied. "Jonathan Wells." George repeated the name silently, rolling it around in his mind. It felt ordinary, harmless, yet something about it gnawed at his gut. "That song you were whistling, where did you learn it?" Jonathan's eyes darted away, as if the answer was tangled somewhere in his memories. "It's just something my mom used to sing to me when I was little." He chuckled softly, a hint of sadness in his voice. "I don't even know where she learned it. She disappeared when I was a kid." George's stomach twisted. The words hit him like a gut punch. He took a step closer, his voice low and controlled. "What happened to her?" Jonathan shrugged. "I don't remember much. I was really young when she went missing. After that, I ended up in foster care until I was adopted. I guess some things just get lost in the shuffle." He paused, eyeing George curiously. "Why do you ask?" George's mind was a whirlwind. He wanted to say, "Because that song was the last thing my wife sang to our son before they disappeared." But he bit back the words, fear mingling with hope. He hadn't felt hope in years, and it was almost too painful to confront. "Just curious," George said instead, his voice a bit too stiff. "It's an unusual song." Jonathan smiled, though confusion lingered in his eyes. "Yeah, I guess it is. I've never heard anyone else hum it before." George forced a nod. "Thank you, Jonathan. Carry on." He turned on his heel, walking away with rigid strides, his heart hammered against his ribcage as if it were trying to escape. Thoughts and possibilities ricocheted through his mind. This can't be a coincidence, he thought. The song, Jonathan's features, the way his story echoed the empty spaces in George's own life. By the time George reached his study, his hands were shaking. He clenched them into fists, inhaling deeply to regain control. He needed facts, certainties. Feelings were unreliable. Dangerous things. He picked up the phone and dialed the number of a trusted private investigator, When the voice on the other end answered, George didn't hesitate. "I need you to look into someone for me, Jonathan Wells. I want to know everything. Where he came from, who his parents were, and where he's been." The investigator paused. "Any specific angle?" George's jaw tightened. "Yes. I want to know if he could be my son." The words hung in the air, raw and fragile. He ended the call, his heart thundering with a mix of dread and hope. For the first time in 20 years, the walls he had built around his pain began to crack, and through those cracks, the faint light of possibility seeped in. The morning had given way to the slow creep of afternoon. Sunlight streamed through the large windows of George Parker's study, casting long golden lines across the mahogany floor. The room smelled of old leather, cigar smoke, and polished wood, a place that reflected the life of a man who controlled everything but his own destiny. George leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, staring blankly at the open file on his desk. He was waiting for a call, one that he both anticipated and dreaded. The investigator promised he'd dig deep into Jonathan's past, and George had insisted on urgency. His nerves were taut, the clock on the wall ticking far too loudly. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to anchor himself. "Don't get ahead of yourself," he thought. "It's just a song." But he couldn't shake the feeling that something monumental was about to happen. A knock on the door shattered his thoughts. He opened his eyes to see his butler, Martin, standing in the doorway, his posture perfectly straight, a thin silver tray in his hands. "Mr. Parker, your coffee." George gave a distracted nod. "Thank you, Martin." Martin hesitated, then cleared his throat. "The young gardener, Jonathan. He mentioned wanting to speak with you before he left for the day. Should I send him up?" George's heart skipped a beat. He forced his voice to remain even. "Yes, send him in." As Martin left, George's eyes drifted to the window, the view of the sprawling gardens beyond seeming sharper now, as though reality itself was holding its breath. The door creaked open, and Jonathan stepped inside. He looked hesitant, a little unsure of himself. His hands were smudged with dirt, and his jeans were worn, but his eyes were bright, filled with something George couldn't quite place. "You wanted to talk to me?" George asked, his voice measured, betraying nothing. Jonathan shifted his weight, glancing around the room before meeting George's gaze. "Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for the opportunity here. It's been really nice working in a place like this. Feels peaceful." George nodded slowly, searching the young man's face for clues, anything that might connect the dots swirling in his mind. "You do good work, Jonathan." Jonathan smiled faintly. "Thanks. It's just that sometimes I feel like I've been here before. You know, like déjà vu, or a memory that's just out of reach." George's fingers tightened on the edge of his desk. The words sent a ripple of electricity through him. He kept his expression neutral, but his mind was spinning. "Maybe it's just the gardens," Jonathan continued. "They remind me of a place I used to visit with my mom when I was really little. I can't remember where, though. Just bits and pieces." George's pulse quickened. "What else do you remember?" Jonathan frowned, his brow furrowing as he tried to pull fragments from his memory. "Not much. Just a woman's voice, always singing that song, and a man's voice, deep, steady. He'd read stories to me, I think. I don't know if it's real or just my imagination." He let out a small, awkward laugh. "Guess it doesn't matter." "But it does," George thought fiercely. It mattered more than anything. He studied Jonathan's face, the subtle features that seemed to whisper a resemblance he couldn't ignore. The boy's eyes, the shape of his mouth. There were shadows of Natalie and echoes of himself. The resemblance was maddeningly close, but just shy of certainty. George exhaled slowly, forcing his voice to remain calm. "It's strange how memories work, isn't it? Sometimes the most important ones are the hardest to reach." Jonathan nodded, his smile wistful. "Yeah, I guess that's why I like working in gardens. Things are simple here, clear. You plant something, you care for it, and it grows." He paused, rubbing the back of his neck. "Anyway, I didn't mean to ramble. I'll let you get back to work." He turned to leave, but George's voice stopped him. "Jonathan." Jonathan turned back, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "Would you mind if I asked Martin to extend your contract here? There's plenty of work to be done, and you seem to have a knack for it." Jonathan's face lit up with surprise. Really? I'd love that, Mr. Parker. Thank you. George nodded. Good. I'll make the arrangements. Jonathan left the study with a spring in his step, the door clicking shut behind him. George's facade crumbled the moment he was alone. His hands shook as he pressed his palms flat against the desk, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The clues were piling up, but the truth was still just out of reach, a cruel puzzle missing its final piece. The shrill ring of the phone broke the silence. He snatched it up, his voice tight. Yes. The investigator's voice was calm, steady. Mr. Parker, I have some initial findings. There are a few anomalies in Jonathan Wells's adoption records. I think you'll want to see them. George's throat went dry. How soon can you get here? An hour. George hung up the phone, his knuckles white. 1 hour, in 60 minutes. His world could change forever, and for the first time in 20 years. He felt something dangerous stirring inside him. Hope. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, each second stretching longer than the last. George Parker paced his study, the rhythmic sound of his polished shoes tapping against the hardwood floor doing little to calm his nerves. His mind raced with possibilities. Hope clawing at the edges of his tightly controlled demeanor. He checked his watch for the 5th time in as many minutes. The investigator, Paul Harrington, was late. George's jaw clenched. Harrington wasn't the type to waste time. If he was delayed, it meant something important had come up. George wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or terrified. The faint sound of a car pulling up the gravel driveway sent a jolt through his body. He straightened his tie, forced his expression into a mask of indifference, and walked to the window. The sleek black sedan gleamed under the afternoon sun. Harrington stepped out, a man in his mid-40s with a build that suggested equal parts muscle and caution. He adjusted his glasses, holding a leather briefcase close to his side. A knock at the door snapped George to attention. "Come in," he said, his voice steady, betraying none of his inner turmoil. Harrington entered with brisk efficiency, his face devoid of any emotion. He nodded respectfully. "Mr. Parker, sit." George gestured to the leather chair opposite his desk. Harrington took his seat, placed the briefcase on his lap, and exhaled. "I've found some things you should know." George leaned forward, his fingers interlocked to keep his hands from trembling. "I'm listening." Harrington unlocked the briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. Bound with a thin metal clip, he placed them carefully on the desk, like he was laying down evidence in a courtroom. "Jonathan Wells's adoption records are odd," Harrington began. "He was found near a church in a small town in upstate New York when he was about 3 years old. No name, no identification. Just a note pinned to his shirt that said Jonathan." George's stomach tightened. "That's it. That's it," Harrington confirmed. He was placed in the system, moved through a few foster homes, and eventually adopted by a couple, the Wellses. Good people by all accounts, but they had no idea where he came from. George's gaze bore into the papers, his eyes scanning the details as if willing the truth to reveal itself. What about his birth records? Medical history? Harrington shook his head. There's a gap, almost 2 years missing from his life before he was found. No records, no clues. It's like he appeared out of nowhere. George's jaw tightened. The pieces of the puzzle were jagged and incomplete, but they were beginning to form a picture he couldn't ignore. "There's more," Harrington said, his voice dropping a note lower. He pulled another document from the briefcase and slid it across the desk. "I dug deeper, based on Jonathan's approximate age and the location where he was found. There were 2 reports of missing children around that time. One of them was Joshua Parker." The name sent a jolt through George. His fingers brushed over the paper, tracing the letters of his son's name. The air seemed to thicken around him. "Mr. Parker," Harrington continued carefully. "The details match too closely to ignore. The age, the physical description, even the lullaby he remembers. It all points to Jonathan being your son." George's vision blurred for a moment, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. He forced himself to breathe, to think. He'd spent years preparing himself for the possibility that Joshua was gone forever. To hope was dangerous, and yet, here it was. Hope, solid and terrifying, staring back at him from a stack of paper. "What about DNA?" George asked, his voice rough. Harrington nodded. "I took the liberty of collecting a sample from Jonathan's work gloves. We can have the results in a week, maybe less. A week. 7 days to know for sure. It felt both impossibly long and terrifyingly short. George leaned back in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests. And my wife, Natalie. Harrington hesitated. His eyes shadowed. No sign of her yet. But if Jonathan is Joshua, it means she kept him safe until she couldn't anymore. I'll keep looking. The room fell silent, the air thick with unspoken grief and possibility. George's eyes settled on the photo of Natalie on his desk. Her face, frozen in time, looked back at him with a warmth that felt almost tangible. He reached out, his fingers grazing the frame. I want to know everything. Harrington, he said, his voice low but resolute. No matter how long it takes, no matter what you have to do. Harrington nodded. I'll keep digging. George stood, signaling the end of the meeting, as Harrington gathered his things and left. George remained by the window, watching the investigator's car disappear down the driveway. His mind buzzed with thoughts, memories, and fears. The idea that his son might be alive was almost too much to bear. And if Jonathan was Joshua, what did that mean for Natalie? Had she been lost protecting their son? The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the lawn. George clenched his jaw. He would find the truth, no matter how deep he had to dig or how many ghosts he had to confront. Hope was a dangerous thing, but for the first time in 20 years, he was ready to face it. The quiet hum of the evening settled over the estate. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving a smudge of orange fading into purple across the sky. George Parker stood on the balcony outside his study, his gaze fixed on the distant gardens. Shadows stretched long over the hedges, and somewhere in the stillness, crickets began their nightly chorus. In his hand, he held a glass of bourbon, the amber liquid catching the fading light. He swirled it absently, but his thoughts were tangled in knots, too tight to unravel. The possibility that Jonathan could be his son, Joshua, gnawed at the edges of his composure. He took a slow sip, the warmth spreading through his chest, doing little to calm him. A week. He had to wait a week for the DNA results. The seconds felt like hours. The hours like days. Patience was never his virtue, especially when it came to matters of the heart. A heart he'd convinced himself was numb long ago. A knock at the door broke his reverie. "Come in," he called, his voice low, the weight of his thoughts dragging him down. The door creaked open, and Jonathan stepped in. Hesitating in the doorway, he'd cleaned up for the evening, his dirt-streaked jeans replaced by simple slacks and a t-shirt. His hair was still tousled, but there was an air of quiet dignity about him, as if he belonged there more than he realized. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Parker?" Jonathan asked. His voice cautious, George turned, leaning against the balcony railing. The soft glow from the study lamps cast shadows across his face, but his eyes were sharp, searching. He gestured for Jonathan to join him outside. "Come here. The view is better from the balcony." Jonathan stepped forward, his footsteps hesitant. He joined George by the railing, his eyes widening slightly at the expanse of the gardens below, now cloaked in twilight. "It's beautiful," Jonathan murmured, his gaze sweeping across the manicured hedges and winding paths. George nodded. "It was my wife's favorite place. She spent hours out here, tending to the flowers, making sure everything was perfect." Jonathan's fingers brushed the railing absent-mindedly. "Sounds like she loved it here." "She did." George's voice was softer than he intended. He glanced at Jonathan, the boy's profile outlined by the fading light. The same profile he'd seen in old photographs of Joshua. The resemblance felt like a blade pressing against his chest. "Jonathan," George said, measuring his words carefully, "do you remember anything else about your mother? Anything more specific?" Jonathan's brow furrowed, his fingers tightening on the railing. "Not much, just flashes, really. Her face is blurry, but I remember her voice. She had this calm way of talking, like everything was going to be okay." He paused, his jaw tightening. "Sometimes I think I remember a house, big and white, with windows that caught the sunlight, but it's like trying to remember a dream." George's grip on his glass tightened. A big white house with sunlit windows. It sounded like his estate. His throat constricted. "And your father? Do you remember him at all?" Jonathan shook his head slowly. "I used to think I did, but Now I'm not sure if it was real or just something I made up to fill in the blanks. There was a man with a deep voice who read me stories, but it's all jumbled. The air between them thickened, heavy with unspoken truths. George's heart ached at the thought of his son, ripped from his life and left to piece together a fragmented past. How much pain had Jonathan endured, trying to make sense of a life that never fit together? I've always wondered, Jonathan continued, his voice low, almost a whisper, why she left, why she didn't come back for me. He looked away, his jaw clenched. Maybe she couldn't, or maybe she didn't want to. George felt a sharp pang of guilt. He wanted to reach out, to tell Jonathan that none of this was his fault, that if his mother didn't come back, it wasn't because she didn't want him, but the words lodged in his throat, stuck behind the walls he'd built over the years. Sometimes life doesn't give us answers, George said finally, his voice rough. But that doesn't mean the people who love us stop caring. Jonathan nodded, but his eyes held a shadow of doubt. He pulled in a shaky breath and forced a smile. Thanks, Mr. Parker. I guess some things are just meant to stay a mystery. George's jaw tightened. No, he thought fiercely. Some mysteries demand answers. He watched as Jonathan turned to leave, the young man's shoulders slightly hunched, weighed down by invisible burdens. As the door closed softly behind him, George's composure cracked. He set the glass down, his hands trembling. The pieces were there. Jonathan's memories, the song, the house. They pointed to a truth that was almost too painful to confront, but he had to know. The past was clawing its way back into his life, demanding resolution. He walked back into the study, his eyes cold and determined. He picked up the phone and dialed Harrington's number again. The call went straight to voicemail. Paul, it's me. I need you to expedite the results. I don't care what it takes. Just get them to me as soon as possible. He hung up, his heart pounding. Time was the enemy now, and he refused to let it steal another moment. The truth was within reach, and this time, he wouldn't let it slip away. The house was silent, a deep, suffocating stillness that seemed to wrap around George Parker like a shroud. He sat in the grand living room, a fire crackling in the hearth, but its warmth didn't reach him. The clock on the mantel ticked away the minutes, each one a taunting reminder that he was still waiting for answers, waiting for the truth. A glass of bourbon rested untouched on the side table. The liquid glistened in the firelight, but George couldn't bring himself to drink. His mind buzzed with thoughts of Jonathan, Joshua. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they formed was still hazy, incomplete. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration gnawing at him. He needed something more, something concrete. The investigators' findings were compelling, but the gaps in Jonathan's past haunted him. There had to be another clue, something buried in the house, a whisper from the past that he'd overlooked. A sudden thought struck him. Natalie's study. He hadn't stepped foot in that room in years after she disappeared. He'd locked the door, as if sealing away the memories could also seal away the pain. But now, those memories might hold the answers he so desperately needed. With a resolute breath, he stood up, his footsteps echoing through the empty house. He made his way to the east wing, the hallway dimly lit by antique sconces. The door to Natalie's study stood at the end, a silent guardian of the past. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the brass doorknob. For a moment, doubt crept in. What if he found nothing? What if reopening this chapter only deepened the wound? But the thought of Jonathan, Joshua, pushed him forward. He needed the truth, no matter the cost. He turned the knob, the door creaking open slowly. A wave of stale air and forgotten memories washed over him. The room was just as he remembered it. The faint scent of lavender, the soft glow of the desk lamp, papers neatly stacked, and books lined up on the shelves. It was as if time had frozen the moment she disappeared. George stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under his weight. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the delicate touches that were so distinctly Natalie. Her handwriting on stray notes, the small porcelain vase she loved, the framed photo of their family, him, Natalie, and a smiling gap-toothed Joshua. His throat tightened. He picked up the photo, his fingers tracing the edges. How had everything gone so horribly wrong? He placed the frame back on the desk and let his eyes wander. Then he saw it. A leather-bound book tucked between two larger volumes on the shelf. His heart skipped a beat. Natalie's diary. With trembling hands, he pulled it free, the worn leather cool against his fingertips. He sat in her chair, the weight of the book heavy in his palms. For a moment, he couldn't bring himself to open it. It felt like an invasion, like reading her thoughts was a betrayal of the love they'd shared. But he forced himself to remember why he was here. This wasn't just about him. It was about finding Joshua, about understanding what had happened. He opened the diary, the spine creaking softly. Her handwriting sprawled across the pages, elegant and familiar. He skimmed through the entries, his heart aching at the snippets of her life, the joys, the worries, the little notes about Joshua's antics. Then he found it, an entry dated just days before she disappeared. I don't know if I'm being paranoid, but something feels wrong. Linda's been acting strange lately, asking questions about George's business, about our family. I've caught her in the study a few times, looking through our papers. When I confronted her, she laughed it off, said I was imagining things, but I can't shake the feeling that she's up to something. I need to be careful. I need to protect Joshua. George's blood ran cold. He read the words again, the meaning sinking in like a stone in his gut. Linda, his own sister, the woman who had stood beside him at Natalie's memorial, who had comforted him when he thought he'd lost everything. Had she been the one who tore his life apart? His hands shook as he turned the page. I've decided to keep a backup of our important documents. If something happens to me, I want George to know the truth. I'm hiding the copies in the garden shed, behind the old tool cabinet. Maybe I'm overreacting, but I'd rather be safe than sorry. The diary slipped from his fingers, landing on the desk with a soft thud. His mind raced. If Natalie had hidden something in the garden shed, it could be the missing piece, the proof he needed to confront Linda, to finally uncover what had happened to his wife and son. He surged to his feet, adrenaline coursing through his veins. The clock on the wall chimed softly, marking the late hour, but he didn't care. He grabbed a flashlight from the hallway drawer and headed outside, the cool night air biting at his skin. The garden stretched out before him, bathed in shadows. The shed loomed at the far end, a dark silhouette against the moonlit sky. He walked briskly, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The gravel crunched under his feet, each step bringing him closer to the truth. He reached the shed, the old wooden door creaking as he pushed it open. The scent of soil and metal filled the air. He swept the flashlight beam across the room until it landed on the tool cabinet. His heart pounded as he moved it aside, the effort making his muscles strain. Behind the cabinet, a small compartment was hidden in the wall. He pried it open, his breath caught in his throat. Inside, wrapped in a worn cloth, were documents, photographs, and a flash drive. George's hands shook as he gathered the bundle. The answers were here. The truth was finally within his grasp, and this time, he wouldn't let it slip away. George's fingers gripped the bundle tightly as he stepped back into the moonlight. The cool night air pressed against his skin, doing little to quell the heat of adrenaline coursing through his veins. The weight of the hidden documents was more than just paper and ink. It was the weight of truth, of answers long buried, threatening to upend everything he thought he knew. He walked briskly back to the house, his flashlight bobbing with each determined step. Shadows danced along the path, but George barely noticed. His mind was locked on one thought: Linda, the woman who had stood by his side through grief and loss, the woman who, if Natalie's suspicions were correct, had been orchestrating his destruction all along. As he entered the study, the fire had burned down to embers, casting a reddish glow that made the room feel ominous. He dropped the bundle on the desk and took a steadying breath before unwrapping it. The cloth fell away, revealing a stack of documents and a small flash drive. His eyes skimmed over the first few pages. Bank statements, handwritten notes, correspondence. At first glance, they seemed innocuous, but as he read deeper, the puzzle pieces began to fit. Transactions traced back to accounts linked to Linda, letters discussing property transfers and power of attorney, mentions of safeguarding the family's interests that now felt like thinly veiled threats. George's jaw clenched, his teeth grinding together. The betrayal was so sharp it felt physical. How had he not seen this? How had she deceived him so thoroughly? He picked up the flash drive, his hands steady despite the fury boiling inside him. He plugged it into his computer, the screen illuminating with a cold blue light. The files loaded quickly, folders labeled with dates, cryptic initials, and one that made his heart stop. Joshua. His finger hovered over the trackpad, a moment of dread freezing him in place. What if this was another dead end? What if the answers he sought would only lead to more pain? But he shook off the hesitation. He had come too far to stop now. He clicked on the folder. Images appeared. Photos of a young boy, barely 3 years old, with wide eyes and a gap-toothed smile. The timestamp in the corner confirmed it. These were taken shortly after Joshua disappeared. George's chest tightened. The boy in the photos was Joshua. He'd recognize his son's face anywhere. Another file. A video. He clicked it, his breath shallow. The screen flickered to life, showing a dimly lit room. A woman's voice, strained and familiar, filled the silence. "Please, just let us go. We haven't done anything to you." George's knees nearly buckled. Natalie, her face was gaunt, her eyes filled with desperation. She clutched Joshua tightly to her chest, the boy's face buried in her shoulder, his small body trembling. A voice responded, cold and smooth. George's blood turned to ice. "Your husband needs to learn that he can't have everything. If taking you away is the only way to teach him that lesson, then so be it, Linda." The video cut off abruptly, leaving George in stunned silence. The betrayal echoed through him, each word a dagger twisting deeper into his heart. His own sister, the woman he had trusted, who had shared his grief, had been the architect of his ruin. He sank into the chair, his hands gripping the armrests, his knuckles white. His thoughts spiraled into rage, confusion, and a grief so raw it threatened to consume him. He wanted to confront Linda immediately, to demand answers, to make her pay for the devastation she had wrought. But he couldn't afford to lose control now. He needed a plan. This had to be handled carefully, methodically. He couldn't risk Linda slipping away or destroying evidence. He had to be strategic. For Natalie, for Jonathan, Joshua. A sudden knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. He slammed the laptop shut and pushed the documents into a drawer, his heart pounding. "Come in," he said, his voice strained but controlled. The door opened, and Linda stepped inside. Her heels clicked softly against the floor, and she offered him a smile that now felt like poison. "George, you're still up?" she asked, feigning concern. "You look exhausted." He forced a tight smile, the muscles in his jaw aching. "Couldn't sleep." She moved closer, her eyes scanning his face. "You've been working too hard. You need to take care of yourself." Her tone was syrupy sweet, but George heard the undercurrent, the carefully hidden sharpness beneath her words. "I appreciate your concern," he said, his voice cold. "But I'm fine." She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Are you sure? You seem troubled." He met her gaze, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. "I've been thinking a lot about the past lately. About Natalie. About Joshua." Linda's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. But it was enough. Her eyes flickered with something he hadn't seen before. Fear. "Sometimes the past is best left buried," she said softly. George's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Sometimes the past refuses to stay buried." Linda's eyes locked onto his, a silent battle waging between them. For the first time, George saw her for what she truly was, a predator who had hidden in plain sight, cloaked in family ties and false affection. "I suppose you're right," she murmured. "Good night, George." She turned and walked out, the door clicking shut behind her. The moment she was gone, George's shoulders slumped, the weight of the confrontation leaving him drained, but a fire had ignited within him. The truth was out, and now there was no turning back. He would bring Linda down, piece by piece, for Natalie, for Jonathan, for the 20 years of stolen time. This war wasn't over. It was just beginning. The morning sunlight filtered through the heavy curtains of George Parker's study, casting faint patterns across the walls. The events of the previous night clung to him like a suffocating fog. He hadn't slept. The weight of betrayal, the evidence of Linda's treachery, and the haunting images of Natalie and Joshua had replayed in his mind relentlessly. He sat at his desk, a cup of coffee untouched by his side, his eyes fixed on the drawer where the damning documents lay hidden. Every fiber of his being screamed for action. He wanted to confront Linda, to drag her into the light of her own guilt, but he couldn't afford to act rashly. Not now. A faint knock interrupted his thoughts. George straightened, composing himself. "Come in." The door opened slowly, and Jonathan stepped in. His dark hair was damp, and he wore a simple gray t-shirt and jeans. He looked younger than usual, as if the weight he carried was momentarily lifted, but his eyes held a flicker of hesitation. "Morning, Mr. Parker," Jonathan said, his voice tentative. "I didn't mean to interrupt." George forced a smile that felt brittle. "You're not interrupting. Come in." Jonathan walked over to the window, his hands tucked into his pockets. He stared out at the garden, the morning light dancing over the dew-drenched roses. "It's peaceful here," he said softly. "I never really had a place that felt like home." George's chest tightened. He wanted to tell him, to blurt out everything, that he did have a home, a family, that he wasn't Jonathan Wells, but Joshua Parker. But the words caught in his throat, tangled in doubt and fear, until the DNA results came back. Certainty remained just out of reach. "You seem troubled," Jonathan said, turning to face him. "Everything okay?" George studied the boy's face. There was a kindness in his eyes, a quiet strength that reminded him so much of Natalie. It made the ache in his heart deepen. "There's just a lot on my mind," George admitted. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down, Jonathan. I'd like to talk." Jonathan hesitated, then sank into the chair, his eyes curious but cautious. George leaned forward, his elbows on the desk. "You mentioned yesterday that you don't remember much about your early childhood." Jonathan nodded slowly. "Yeah, just flashes, really. Nothing that makes sense." "What if," George said carefully, "there was a way to find out more, to know where you really came from?" Jonathan's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" George took a deep breath, choosing his words with care. "Sometimes the past holds answers we didn't even know we were looking for. I've been curious about your story, about how you ended up here." Jonathan's eyes narrowed slightly, suspicion creeping in. "Why do you care so much, Mr. Parker?" George's heart hammered in his chest. He couldn't lie to the boy. Not anymore. He leaned back, his gaze steady. "Because I think your story might be connected to mine. To my family." Jonathan's eyes widened. He looked away, his fingers drumming restlessly on the armrest. "You think I'm someone else?" George hesitated, then nodded. "I think you might be my son, Joshua." The words hung in the air, raw and unguarded. Jonathan's face went pale, his eyes searching George's for any hint of deception. That's not possible," Jonathan stammered. "My mom, she didn't abandon you," George interrupted, his voice tight with emotion. "She was taken. You were taken. And I've spent the last 20 years trying to make sense of it." Jonathan shook his head, his jaw clenched. "This doesn't make any sense." "Why now? Why are you telling me this?" "Because I have evidence," George said softly. "I found records, photographs, things that point to you being Joshua, and I'm waiting on DNA results to confirm it." Jonathan shot to his feet, his eyes blazing. "You did a DNA test without telling me." George stood too, his voice firm but gentle. "I had to know. I had to find the truth." Jonathan's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. "You don't get to decide that for me. You don't get to dig into my past like it's some kind of mystery to solve." George's heart twisted. "I'm sorry, Jonathan, but if there's even the slightest chance you're my son, I couldn't walk away from it." Jonathan took a shaky breath, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "What if you're wrong? What if this is just some cruel mistake?" George's voice cracked. "Then I'll respect whatever you decide. But if I'm right, if you are Joshua, then we have a chance to put the pieces back together, to heal." The room fell silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Jonathan's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. He looked lost, a boy adrift in a sea of uncertainty. "I need time," he whispered. George nodded, his own eyes burning. "Take all the time you need." Jonathan turned and walked out of the study, his footsteps heavy. The door closed softly behind him, and George sank back into his chair, the exhaustion of the last 20 years crashing over him. The truth was out now, a fragile, dangerous thing, and all he could do was wait and hope that, this time, it wouldn't shatter them both. The silence in the house felt different now, heavier, more fragile. George Parker sat in the study, his fingers tracing the rim of a half-empty coffee cup. He had lost track of time since Jonathan walked out. Minutes blurred into hours, each one gnawing at his patience. Doubt whispered in his mind, but he forced himself to hold on to a shred of hope. The weight of the truth had been laid bare between them. There was no taking it back now. A faint creak in the hallway made his heart jolt. He looked up, his eyes drawn to the door. Jonathan stood there, his posture tense, his face a storm of emotions barely held in check. "Can I come in?" Jonathan asked. His voice low. George nodded, swallowing hard. "Of course." Jonathan stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the floor. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Finally, Jonathan spoke. "I've been walking around the gardens trying to make sense of this." He lifted his gaze to meet George's eyes. "I don't know what to believe." George's chest tightened. "I understand." Jonathan rubbed the back of his neck, his jaw working. "You said there's evidence, photos, records. Can I see them?" George's heart pounded. He stood and crossed to the desk, pulling open the drawer where he'd hidden the documents. Carefully, he laid them out on the desk. The photographs of Joshua, the bank statements, the video file on the flash drive. Each piece felt like a fragment of a shattered life, laid bare for inspection. Jonathan stepped forward, his fingers hovering above the photos. He picked up the image of a little boy with wide, innocent eyes and a toothy grin. His brow furrowed as he studied it. "That's me," he whispered, his voice tinged with disbelief. "I mean, it looks like me." George's throat ached. "It is you. You were 3 years old when you disappeared. That's the last picture we took before." He trailed off, the memory too painful to finish. Jonathan set the photo down with trembling hands. What happened to her? To my mom? George hesitated, the weight of the answer crushing him. She was taken too, by someone we both trusted. My sister, Linda. Jonathan's eyes flashed with confusion and anger. Your sister, why would she do that? Jealousy. Resentment. I didn't see it then, but she hated the life Natalie and I had. She hated that I was happy. George's voice hardened. She took everything from me, from us. Jonathan took a step back, shaking his head. This is insane. It sounds like some twisted movie plot. I wish it were, George said softly. But it's our reality. Jonathan turned away, his shoulders hunched. He ran his hands through his hair, a ragged breath escaping him. All this time, I thought I was just some kid who got left behind. I thought maybe my mom didn't want me. George's heart splintered. He crossed the room, placing a tentative hand on Jonathan's shoulder. You were never unwanted. Your mother loved you fiercely. She did everything she could to protect you. Jonathan's shoulders shook slightly, and George felt a deep ache at the vulnerability radiating from the boy. He pulled his hand back, giving him space to process. After a long moment, Jonathan turned around, his eyes red-rimmed but determined. Why now? Why did you decide to look into this? George met his gaze, his voice trembling. Because I heard you whistling that song. The same song Natalie used to sing to you every night. It was like hearing a ghost. I couldn't ignore it. Jonathan swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. And the DNA test, when do we know for sure? George's voice was steady. A few more days, but in my heart, I already know. You are Joshua. Jonathan's eyes searched George's face, looking for something. Certainty, reassurance, maybe even forgiveness. What if you're wrong? He asked. His voice barely above a whisper. George's eyes softened. Then I'll accept it. But if I'm right, we have a chance to rebuild what was taken from us. Jonathan's lips trembled. He looked away, blinking rapidly. It's a lot to take in. I know, George said. Take your time. I'm not going anywhere. Jonathan nodded, his jaw tight. He turned toward the door, pausing with his hand on the knob. I'm going to need some space, he said, his voice strained. I need to figure out who I am. George's chest felt like it was being crushed, but he managed a nod. I understand. Take all the time you need. Jonathan hesitated for a moment longer, then walked out, the door closing softly behind him. The sound echoed through the room, leaving George alone with his thoughts. He sank into his chair, his head falling into his hands. The hope that had been building inside him now felt fragile, like glass on the verge of shattering. He had given Jonathan the truth. But what if the truth wasn't enough? What if the scars of the past were too deep to heal? The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, each second a reminder that time was still moving forward, even when everything else felt stuck in limbo. But for the first time in 20 years, George was willing to wait. Because if there was even the slightest chance of reclaiming his son, it was worth every agonizing second. The days blurred together, each one weighed down by a silence that pressed on George's chest like a stone. The air in the house felt stale, as though it too was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the tension. Jonathan had kept his distance, retreating to the far end of the estate, where the sprawling gardens gave him solitude. George respected his need for space, but each passing moment chipped away at his patience. He spent his hours in his study, pretending to focus on business reports and emails, but his mind wandered constantly. His thoughts looped endlessly around Jonathan, the DNA results, and the dark betrayal that Linda had orchestrated. The phone on his desk buzzed, shattering his reverie. He snatched it up, his heart thudding. "This is Harrington." The investigator's voice crackled over the line. "I have the results." George's breath caught in his throat. His fingers tightened around the phone. And there was a brief pause, the silence stretching unbearably. "It's a match, Mr. Parker. Jonathan is your son." George's world tilted. Relief, joy, and anguish collided in his chest, making it hard to breathe. He sank back into his chair, his hand trembling. His mind raced with the implications, but one thought burned brighter than the rest. "Joshua is alive." "Thank you, Harrington," he managed, his voice rough. "You've done more than I can ever repay." "It was my pleasure," Harrington said, his tone softening. "Good luck, Mr. Parker." George ended the call and sat in stunned silence. The truth was finally confirmed. The boy who had been working in his garden, the young man who carried the weight of forgotten memories, was his son, his Joshua. A sense of urgency swelled within him. He needed to tell Jonathan. To bridge the chasm between them before it widened any further, he stood abruptly, pushing away the swirl of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He had to stay focused. There was too much at stake. He found Jonathan by the old oak tree at the edge of the property, where the air smelled of damp earth and pine. The boy was seated on the ground, his back resting against the gnarled trunk. Eyes fixed on the distant horizon, he looked lost in thought. The lines of confusion and sadness etched across his face. George's heart ached. He approached slowly, his footsteps muffled by the soft grass. "Jonathan," he called gently. Jonathan turned, surprise flickering in his eyes. He quickly masked it with guarded wariness. "Mr. Parker," George swallowed, his throat tight. "I need to talk to you. It's important." Jonathan nodded and pushed himself to his feet, brushing dirt from his jeans. "Okay?" George hesitated, searching for the right words. How did a father explain 20 years of loss, of hope buried under grief? "The results came back," George said finally. His voice trembled. "You're my son, Jonathan. You're Joshua." Jonathan's eyes widened, his mouth opening slightly as if to say something, but no words came. He took a step back, his face pale. "Are you sure?" he whispered. George nodded, his vision blurring. "Yes, the DNA test confirmed it. You're my son." Jonathan's chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. He looked away, his jaw clenched. "This doesn't change everything. I don't even know who I am anymore." George took a cautious step forward. "You're Joshua Parker, my son, but you're also Jonathan. And no matter who you've been, we can figure out who you are together." Jonathan's eyes glistened. "I've spent my whole life trying to figure out where I belonged, and now I'm supposed to believe I'm someone else entirely." George's voice broke. "You're not someone else. You're still you, and I'm still your father." Jonathan's face crumpled. He turned away, his hands clenching into fists. "I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can just be your son." George's heart splintered. He took another step closer, his voice gentle. "I'm not asking you to do anything you're not ready for, but I want you to know I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Jonathan's shoulders shook, and a strangled sob escaped his lips. He turned back to George, his eyes red, tears streaming down his face. Why did this happen to us? Why did she take everything away? George's own tears welled up. He closed the distance between them, and hesitating only a moment, wrapped his arms around his son. Jonathan stiffened at first, but then he collapsed into George's embrace, his sobs racking his body. "I don't know," George whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know why she did it, but we're here now, and we'll get through this." Jonathan clung to him, the barriers between them crumbling under the weight of shared grief and long-lost love. George held him tightly, as if anchoring them both to the moment, to the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild what had been stolen, after what felt like an eternity. Jonathan pulled back, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. His voice was shaky. "What happens now?" George took a deep breath, determination hardening his features. "Now we get answers, and we make sure Linda can never hurt us again." Jonathan nodded, a flicker of resolve sparking in his eyes. "I want to know the truth, all of it." George's jaw tightened. "Then that's what we'll find, together." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying away the remnants of doubt and fear. For the first time in 20 years, George felt the stirrings of something he thought he'd lost forever: hope. The air in the study was tense, vibrating with a sense of purpose that hadn't been there in years. George Parker stood at the desk, his hands flat on the polished wood surface. Across from him, Jonathan sat, his face pale but determined. The weight of their shared truth hung between them, fragile but unbreakable. "We need to go through everything," George said, his voice steady. "Every document, every clue. We need to understand exactly what Linda did and why." Jonathan nodded, his jaw set. "I want to know everything. I need to know." George pulled the bundle of documents from the drawer and spread them across the desk. The photographs, the bank records, the notes, all threads in the tangled web that Linda had woven. He pushed the flash drive toward Jonathan. "There's a video on here," George said, his voice tightening. "It's hard to watch, but it shows your mother and what she went through." Jonathan's fingers hovered over the drive, his eyes clouding with hesitation. He swallowed hard and nodded. "I need to see it." George inserted the flash drive into his laptop. The screen flickered to life, casting a pale glow over their faces. He clicked on the video file, and the image appeared. A dimly lit room, a figure hunched protectively over a small child. Natalie. Jonathan's breath hitched as he leaned in closer. The woman's face was gaunt, her eyes filled with desperation. The little boy clutched in her arms was trembling, his face buried in her shoulder. "Please, just let us go," Natalie's voice pleaded, cracking with fear. "We haven't done anything to you." A cold, familiar voice responded, calm and detached. "Your husband needs to learn that he can't have everything. Taking you away is the only way to teach him that lesson." Jonathan's face twisted, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the desk. "That's her, isn't it, Linda?" George's voice was tight. "Yes." On the screen, Natalie's eyes flashed with anger and resolve. "You won't get away with this." Linda's cold laugh filled the room. "I already have." The video cut off abruptly, leaving a hollow silence. George's chest ached as he looked at Jonathan, whose eyes were glistening with unshed tears. The boy's hands shook as he wiped at his face. "She was trying to protect me," Jonathan whispered, his voice raw. "All this time, she was fighting for me." George's throat tightened. "She loved you more than anything, and she did everything she could to keep you safe." Jonathan took a deep breath, his face hardening. "We can't let Linda get away with this. She needs to pay for what she did." George nodded, his jaw clenched. "She will, but we need to be careful. Linda is smart, and she's dangerous when cornered." A sharp knock at the door jolted them both. George's heart jumped. He exchanged a look with Jonathan, their unspoken understanding clear. "Come in," George called, his voice firm. The door swung open, and Linda stepped inside. She wore a tailored navy dress, her posture poised, her smile polished to perfection, but her eyes betrayed her. The cold calculation lurking behind them was sharper than ever. "George," she said smoothly, her gaze flickering to Jonathan before settling back on him. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." George forced a smile, the muscles in his jaw tight. "Not at all, we were just talking." Linda's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "I see, well, I wanted to check on you. You've seemed preoccupied lately." I have a lot on my mind, George replied evenly. Family matters. Linda's smile faltered for a split second. Family is important, she said, her voice softening. It's good to know who you can trust. Jonathan's hands curled into fists at his sides. George saw it and placed a calming hand on his shoulder. Trust is earned, George said, his eyes locked on Linda's. And sometimes it's broken. For the briefest moment, Linda's mask slipped, and George saw the flicker of fear in her eyes. She knew, maybe not everything, but she sensed the tide turning against her. I hope everything's all right, Linda said, her voice tight. If you need anything, I'm here. Thank you, George said, his tone laced with a meaning only she would understand. I'll keep that in mind. Linda hesitated, her eyes darting between them one last time before she nodded and turned on her heel, walking out with forced grace. The door closed behind her with a quiet click, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the room. George exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. Jonathan turned to him, his eyes blazing. She knows we're onto her. George nodded. Good. That means she's scared. What do we do now? Jonathan asked, his voice firm. George's gaze hardened. Now, we take away her power. We expose the truth, no matter what it takes. Jonathan's eyes met his, determination mirrored in both their faces. For the first time, George felt the strength of having his son by his side. A bond reforged, a purpose renewed. The storm was coming, but this time, they would face it together. The silence that followed Linda's departure hung in the air like a fog, thick and stifling. George Parker turned to Jonathan, his eyes scanning the boy's face for any sign of hesitation. Instead, he found determination, a reflection of his own resolve. She knows we're onto her, Jonathan said again, his voice steadier this time. She's going to do something. I can feel it. George nodded. We need to stay ahead of her. She's unpredictable when she feels cornered. He rubbed his temples, exhaustion clawing at the edges of his focus. We need a plan. Jonathan paced the study, his brow furrowed. What kind of plan? We have the evidence, don't we? Can't we just go to the police? George exhaled slowly. It's not that simple. Linda has spent years weaving a web of lies. She has connections, people who owe her favors. If we go to the police now, she could spin it to her advantage. We need to make sure the truth is so undeniable that no one can cover it up. Jonathan stopped pacing and faced George, his eyes filled with frustration. How do we do that? George's gaze hardened. We gather more evidence. We find anyone she worked with, anyone who might be able to testify against her. We make sure there's no escape route. Jonathan nodded, his jaw set. Then let's do it. George managed a small smile. The boy's resolve was a beacon in the darkness of their situation. He could see so much of Natalie in him. The same fiery spirit, the same refusal to back down. I'll make some calls, George said, reaching for his phone. Harrington might know people who can help us. We need to move fast. As George dialed the investigator's number, Jonathan walked to the window, his eyes fixed on the garden. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the manicured hedges. He wrapped his arms around himself, his thoughts a tangled mess. Everything had changed so quickly. Days ago, he was just Jonathan Wells, a gardener trying to make sense of his fragmented memories. Now, he was Joshua Parker, the son of a man whose life had been ripped apart by betrayal. The weight of it all pressed down on him, but beneath it, a spark of hope flickered. He wasn't alone anymore. George's voice brought him back. Harrington's on his way. He says he has some leads on people who might have worked with Linda. Jonathan turned around, nodding. Good. George hesitated, studying Jonathan's face. Are you okay? Jonathan shrugged, a wry smile tugging at his lips. I don't know what okay means anymore, but I'm here. I'm ready. George's chest tightened with pride and sorrow. We'll get through this, he said softly. Together. A knock at the door startled them both. George's brow furrowed. That was fast. He walked to the door and opened it, his body tensing when he saw Martin, the butler, standing there with a troubled expression. Mr. Parker, Martin said, his voice low. There's a problem. George's heart sank. What is it? It's Ms. Linda, Martin said, glancing nervously at Jonathan. She's in the drawing room with two men I've never seen before. They're asking questions about you. Jonathan's face paled. She knows we're going after her. George's jaw clenched. Stay here, he told Jonathan. I'll handle this. No, Jonathan said firmly. I'm coming with you. George hesitated. But the determination in Jonathan's eyes left no room for argument. He nodded. All right, but stay close. They followed Martin down the hallway, the soft carpet muffling their footsteps. George's mind raced, calculating possibilities, weighing risks. Whatever Linda was planning, he had to stay one step ahead. As they approached the drawing room, the low murmur of voices became clearer. George pushed the door open, his expression cold and controlled. Linda stood by the fireplace, her posture elegant but rigid. Her smile was tight, her eyes gleaming with malice. Beside her, 2 men in dark suits stood with their hands clasped in front of them, their faces unreadable. George, Linda purred, her voice smooth as silk. I was just telling these gentlemen how concerned I am for your well-being. George's eyes narrowed. Is that so? Yes, she said, her smile widening. I've noticed you've been acting erratically. I thought it would be best to bring in some professionals, just to make sure everything is in order. Jonathan stepped closer to George, his voice low but fierce. You're lying. Linda's eyes flicked to Jonathan, her smile faltering for a split second. And you must be the new gardener. How interesting that you're so involved in my brother's affairs. George's voice was ice. Cut the act, Linda. We know the truth. Her eyes darkened, her facade cracking. You know nothing. George stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. I know you took Natalie and Joshua. I know you destroyed my family, and I know you're going to pay for it. Linda's face twisted with anger. The men beside her shifted, their expressions hardening. The room felt like a powder keg, seconds from exploding. George, Linda said, her voice trembling with barely restrained fury. You have no idea what you're up against. I don't care, George shot back. This ends now. The tension snapped like a wire pulled too tight. Linda's eyes blazed with fury. But George stood his ground, Jonathan at his side. For the first time in years, George felt the clarity of purpose, the fire of justice burning bright within him. The storm was here, and they were ready to face it. The silence in the drawing room was thick, broken only by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. George Parker stood tall, his eyes locked onto Linda's, a silent battle of wills unfolding between them. Jonathan remained close by, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. Linda's expression shifted from feigned concern to cold calculation. Her eyes narrowed, the mask of civility slipping away. The 2 men in suits flanked her, their presence menacing, their eyes scanning George and Jonathan with detached professionalism. George, Linda said, her voice soft but laced with venom. You're making a scene. You've been under a lot of stress. Maybe you need rest. George's jaw tightened. I need justice, and I'm done playing your games. One of the men cleared his throat, his voice low and controlled. Mr. Parker, we're here to ensure everything is in order. Mrs. Parker has expressed concerns about your mental state. We're prepared to take necessary steps if you're a danger to yourself or others. Jonathan took a step forward, his eyes blazing. This is a setup. She's trying to frame him. The man's gaze flicked to Jonathan, his face impassive. And who are you, exactly? George spoke before Jonathan could. He's my son, and he's right. This is a pathetic attempt to cover up Linda's crimes. Linda's smile vanished completely, her eyes narrowing into slits. You've always been so dramatic, George. And now, you've dragged this poor boy into your delusions. George's voice was like steel. The DNA results came back. Jonathan is Joshua, the son you stole from me. A flicker of fear flashed in Linda's eyes before she quickly masked it with disdain. You're grasping at straws. George didn't flinch. I have the documents, the photos, the video of you holding Natalie captive. The web you spun is unraveling, Linda. It's over. Her eyes darted to the men beside her. George saw the subtle tightening of her jaw, the way her fingers curled slightly. She was calculating her next move. He had her cornered, and she knew it. One of the men shifted, his tone hardening. If you have such evidence, Mr. Parker, perhaps we should go to the authorities. George nodded. That's exactly where we're going, but not with her pulling the strings. Linda's facade cracked. a hiss escaping her lips. "You always thought you were better than me, George. The golden boy who could do no wrong. But you were blind. You didn't see what was right in front of you." George's eyes darkened. "What I see now is a woman who let hatred consume her. You betrayed your own family." Her eyes glistened with rage. "Family? You don't know the first thing about family. All you ever cared about was your perfect life, your perfect wife, your perfect son. You left me behind. You owed me." Jonathan's voice broke through, sharp and clear. "No one owed you anything. You destroyed lives because of your own bitterness." Linda's gaze snapped to Jonathan, her lips twisting into a cruel smile. "And what do you know, Joshua? You spent your life in the dirt, clueless about who you really are. You're nothing more than a pawn." Jonathan took a step forward, his eyes unwavering. "I'm more than you'll ever be. You tried to erase me, but I'm still here, and you're going to pay for everything you did." The room seemed to vibrate with unspoken fury. George placed a hand on Jonathan's shoulder, grounding them both. He took a deep breath, his voice low and controlled. "Linda, you have one chance. Turn yourself in. Confess. Maybe, just maybe, there's a shred of redemption left for you." Linda laughed bitterly. "Redemption? You really haven't changed. George, always thinking you can fix everything." She turned to the men beside her. "We're done here." But neither man moved. The one on the left pulled out his phone, his eyes still on Linda. "We've heard enough," he said. "We're not part of your scheme. If what Mr. Parker says is true, you'll be dealing with the police. Not us." Linda's face went pale. "What are you doing? I hired you." The man's gaze was cold. "We're not here to break the law." Without another word, the two men turned and walked out, leaving Linda standing alone. The silence that followed was deafening. George felt Jonathan's shoulder relax slightly under his hand. Linda's eyes darted around the room, panic setting in. Her carefully constructed world was collapsing, and she knew it. Her hands shook, her breathing ragged. "You're finished," George said softly. Her eyes blazed one last time, defiance flickering through the fear. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is," Jonathan replied, his voice steady. "You've lost." The sound of approaching sirens cut through the air, growing louder with each passing second. Linda's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of her. For the first time, George saw her not as the powerful, manipulative sister who had torn his world apart, but as a broken woman. Hollowed out by her own bitterness, the front door burst open, and uniformed officers flooded in. Linda didn't resist as they took her by the arms, her face blank, her eyes staring ahead, unseeing. As she was led away, George exhaled slowly, the weight of years of grief and guilt lifting from his shoulders. He turned to Jonathan, who met his gaze with a mix of relief and exhaustion. "It's over," George said, the words feeling almost foreign on his tongue. Jonathan nodded, his eyes glistening. "Yeah, it is." George pulled him into a tight embrace, his heart pounding with emotions too vast to name. For the first time in 20 years, there was no longer a void where his son should be. Together, they stood in the drawing room, the echoes of the past finally fading, replaced by the promise of a new beginning. The front door closed with a quiet finality, the echoes of the police officer's footsteps fading into the distance. George Parker stood in the hallway, his shoulders sagging with the weight of years finally lifted. The silence that filled the house now felt different, no longer oppressive, but expectant, like the hush before the first rays of dawn. Jonathan stood beside him, his face a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. They had done it. Linda was gone, her web of lies unraveled, her power extinguished. And yet, the victory felt surreal, as if one wrong move might shatter it all. George turned to his son, his voice gentle. "You all right?" Jonathan exhaled slowly, running a hand through his tousled hair. "I don't know. It feels like I should feel more. You know, anger, relief, something." He shook his head. "But right now, I just feel empty." George's chest tightened. He reached out, placing a steady hand on Jonathan's shoulder. "You've been carrying this weight for so long. It's okay to feel numb." Jonathan nodded, his eyes distant. "What happens now?" George's gaze softened. "Now, we try to heal. We take it one step at a time." The words felt inadequate, How did one rebuild after 20 years of loss, confusion, and betrayal? George didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, he believed they could find them together. "Come with me," he said, his voice quiet. Jonathan looked at him curiously, but followed as George led him through the house, down a hallway lined with photographs of a past that had been frozen in time. They stopped in front of a door. George hadn't opened in 2 decades. He hesitated, the memories behind it clawing at his heart. He turned the knob and pushed the door open. It was Joshua's old bedroom. Dust particles danced in the slivers of sunlight that filtered through the curtains. The walls were painted a soft blue, decorated with decals of airplanes and stars. A small bed with a faded quilt sat in the corner, surrounded by shelves filled with toys that had long since been abandoned. The air was thick with memories, the ghost of a child's laughter lingering in the stillness. Jonathan stepped inside, his eyes wide, taking in the room as if it were a museum exhibit. He walked over to the shelves, his fingers brushing against a worn teddy bear, a set of wooden blocks, a toy airplane. "This was mine," he whispered, his voice trembling. George nodded, his throat tight. "We left it just as it was. I couldn't bear to change it." Jonathan picked up the teddy bear, its fur matted from years of neglect. He turned it over in his hands, a small smile flickering on his lips. "I think I remember this." George's heart leapt. "You do?" Jonathan nodded, his eyes glassy. Not clearly, just a feeling, like warmth, safety. George swallowed hard, his vision blurring. He wanted to say so much, to apologize for the years lost, to promise that he would never let anything come between them again. But the words felt fragile, insufficient instead. He took a shaky breath. "This room was always waiting for you. I never gave up hope, even when it felt impossible." Jonathan turned to look at him, the teddy bear clutched to his chest. "You didn't give up on me." "Never," George said, his voice breaking. "And I never will." A tear slipped down Jonathan's cheek, but he didn't wipe it away. He walked to the bed and sat down, the springs creaking softly. George hesitated, then sat beside him. The two of them sat in the quiet room, the air between them filled with the unspoken understanding of what they had lost, and what they still had left to rebuild. Jonathan let out a shaky breath. "I don't know how to be Joshua Parker. I've been Jonathan for so long." George nodded slowly. "You don't have to choose. You're both. And whoever you are, whatever you decide, I'll be here." Jonathan looked down at the bear, his fingers tracing the worn seams. "It feels like I'm starting over." George placed a hand on his back, steady and reassuring. "We both are." A faint smile touched Jonathan's lips. For the first time, it felt like the walls around his heart were starting to crack, letting in slivers of light. "Maybe we could fix up the garden together," Jonathan suggested quietly. "Make it something new." George's eyes glistened. "I'd like that." They sat in the silence, the weight of years slowly lifting, replaced by something tentative and fragile. Hope. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with questions and wounds that wouldn't heal overnight. But the pieces of their shattered past were there, ready to be picked up one by one. And together, they would rebuild. The morning sun filtered through the leaves, casting golden dappled patterns over the garden path. A gentle breeze carried the scent of roses and freshly turned soil. The sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling filled the air, blending with the soft scrape of shovels and the rhythmic rustling of gardening gloves against foliage. George Parker straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He glanced over to see Jonathan crouched beside a flower bed, carefully loosening the earth around a cluster of delicate white lilies. The boy's brow was furrowed in concentration, his hands moving with quiet confidence. It was a simple thing, working together in the garden. But for George, it felt like a lifeline, a small act of creation after years of destruction and loss. Jonathan looked up and caught George's gaze. He smiled, tentative but genuine. "I think these lilies will do better here. They need more sunlight." George nodded, a warmth spreading in his chest. "You're right. Your mother used to say the same thing." Jonathan's smile faltered slightly, a shadow passing over his features. He looked down at the flowers, his fingers brushing the petals. "I wish I remembered her better." George swallowed the lump forming in his throat. She would have loved to see you like this. Strong, thoughtful. He hesitated, his voice softening. She loved you so much. Jonathan nodded, his jaw tight. Sometimes I think I can feel it, like a memory just out of reach. He let out a shaky breath. It's hard to know what's real. George knelt beside him, the cool soil beneath his knees grounding him. It's okay to feel that way. Memories can be complicated, especially when they've been taken from you. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But we can create new memories, together. Jonathan's eyes met his, searching for something. Reassurance, perhaps, or the promise of a future that wasn't tangled in shadows. He nodded slowly. Yeah, I'd like that. They worked in companionable silence, the rhythm of digging and planting settling into something steady, something healing. George felt a strange sense of peace, a quiet certainty that they were on the right path, however uncertain and slow it might be. After a while, Jonathan leaned back on his heels, stretching his arms above his head. I didn't think gardening would be this exhausting. George chuckled, the sound surprising him with its lightness. It has a way of sneaking up on you. Jonathan grinned, a real, unguarded smile that made George's heart swell. It's worth it, though, seeing things grow. George nodded, his voice thoughtful. It is. There's something about nurturing life, about watching it bloom, that makes the effort feel meaningful. Jonathan's smile faded slightly, his expression turning serious. Do you think she's still out there, my mom? George's heart twisted. The question hung between them, heavy with longing and uncertainty. He took a deep breath. I want to believe she is, but even if she's not, she lives on in you, in us. Jonathan looked away, blinking rapidly. I just wish I could have one more chance to see her, to ask her why she did everything she did to protect me. George's voice cracked. I wish that too. They sat in the stillness, the weight of unspoken grief settling over them. But this time, it didn't feel insurmountable. It felt like something they could carry together. After a long pause, Jonathan spoke, his voice low. I want to know more about her, about you, about who I was before everything changed. George's chest tightened with a mix of pain and hope. I'll tell you everything, whenever you're ready. Jonathan nodded, his eyes shining. I'm ready now. George smiled, a tear slipping down his cheek. All right, let's start with the day you were born. He began to speak, his words painting pictures of a life that had been stolen from them. He told Jonathan about the first time he held him in his arms, the way Natalie's eyes sparkled with joy, the laughter that used to fill their home. He shared stories of bedtime stories and whispered lullabies, of scraped knees and tearful giggles, of love so fierce it had left an unfillable void when it was torn away. Jonathan listened, his eyes wide and hungry for the memories. He laughed softly at stories of his childhood mischief, his smile faltering when the stories turned bittersweet. But he didn't pull away. He leaned in, absorbing every word, every detail. As the sun climbed higher, the shadows in the garden grew shorter. The weight on George's heart felt lighter, the cracks in his soul beginning to mend. When George finished, they sat in silence, the stories settling between them like a bridge, a connection that had been lost and was now, finally, being rebuilt. Jonathan let out a long breath. Thank you for not giving up. George's voice was thick. You were always worth it. Jonathan smiled, and for the first time, it reached his eyes, bright and full of possibility. I guess we both have a lot of rebuilding to do. George nodded, his heart full. We'll do it together. The wind rustled through the garden, carrying away the ghosts of the past, leaving behind the promise of a new beginning. And for the first time in 2 decades, George felt something bloom deep within him. Hope. The days that followed were filled with a quiet sense of purpose. The house, once weighed down by shadows and memories, was beginning to breathe again. Windows were thrown open, letting in fresh air and sunlight. The creaking floors that used to echo with loneliness now carried the soft sounds of life being rediscovered. George Parker found himself waking up each morning with a renewed sense of possibility. It wasn't perfect. 20 years of grief couldn't be undone in a matter of days. But it was a start, and that was more than he had dared to hope for. He stood in the kitchen, a place he had rarely occupied before, The smell of coffee filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of toast. He set 2 plates on the table, arranging the food with care, the simple act feeling strangely profound. Jonathan walked in, his hair damp from a shower, wearing jeans and a plain shirt. He paused in the doorway, his eyes taking in the scene. The corners of his mouth lifted into a small smile. "You cooked?" he asked, a note of surprise in his voice. George chuckled softly. "Don't get too excited. It's just toast and eggs." Jonathan slid into a chair, the smile lingering. "It's more than I'm used to." George's heart ached at the thought, but he masked it with a smile. "Well, we all have to start somewhere." They ate in companionable silence, the clink of cutlery a comforting rhythm. George found himself glancing at Jonathan, marveling at how quickly the boy was becoming a part of his everyday life. There were still gaps between them, silences filled with unspoken thoughts, but they were growing smaller. As Jonathan finished his last bite, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. "You said you'd tell me more about Mom, about what she was like." George nodded, his chest tightening. "She was incredible, kind, strong, stubborn when she needed to be." He smiled wistfully. "She had a way of making everything feel right, no matter how bad things got." Jonathan's eyes softened. "I wish I remembered her better." "You will?" George assured him. "We'll talk about her as much as you want. We can go through her things together. She left pieces of herself everywhere. In her journals, her photos, the garden. It's all still here." Jonathan nodded, his voice quiet. "I'd like that." George took a sip of his coffee, gathering his thoughts. "I've also been thinking about what's next. For both of us." Jonathan's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" George set down his mug, his gaze steady. "I want to give you choices, Jonathan. You don't have to stay here if you don't want to. You can go back to your life, or we can build something new together. Whatever you decide, I'll support you." Jonathan looked down at his hands, his fingers tracing the edge of his plate. He was silent for a long moment before he spoke, his voice hesitant. "I don't know who I am yet. I've spent so long not knowing where I fit." George's voice was gentle. "That's okay. We'll figure it out. There's no rush." Jonathan's eyes lifted to meet his, a flicker of hope in their depths. "I don't want to go back to being just Jonathan Wells, but I'm not sure how to be Joshua Parker either." George's throat tightened. "You don't have to choose. You're both, and whoever you become, I'll be here for you." Jonathan swallowed hard, a small smile breaking through his uncertainty. "I think I want to stay, at least for now. There's something here, something I want to hold on to." George's heart swelled. "I'd like that more than anything." A comfortable silence settled between them, the kind that spoke of understanding without the need for words. The air felt lighter, the weight of the past beginning to lift. Jonathan pushed back his chair. "I'm going to head out to the garden. There's a section by the east wall that could use some work." George nodded, his smile warm. "I'll join you in a bit." As Jonathan left the kitchen, George sat for a moment, letting the quiet wash over him. It felt different now, less empty, more peaceful. He took a deep breath and stood, walking to the window. He watched Jonathan in the garden, the boy's movements deliberate and steady as he worked the soil. The sunlight caught in his dark hair, highlighting the determination in his expression. For the first time in years, George allowed himself to believe that they could rebuild, that life still held promise. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke his reverie. George's brow furrowed as he walked to the front door. He opened it to see Paul Harrington stepping out of his car, a manila folder tucked under his arm. "Morning, Mr. Parker," Harrington said, his expression serious. George's stomach twisted. "Morning, Paul. What brings you here?" Harrington handed him the folder. "More information on Linda. We found evidence that she had been siphoning funds from your company for years. And there's something else. A lead on Natalie." George's breath caught. "Natalie?" Harrington nodded, his face softening. "There's a chance she might still be out there. We've picked up some clues. Nothing concrete yet, but it's something." George's hands trembled as he took the folder. Hope and fear warred inside him, the possibility almost too much to bear. He swallowed hard. "Thank you, Paul." Harrington nodded. "I'll keep you updated." As the investigator walked away, George closed the door and leaned against it, the folder clutched to his chest. His mind swirled with questions, But one thought rose above all others. If Natalie was still out there, they would find her. He took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. The path ahead was uncertain, but he wasn't alone anymore. With Jonathan by his side, they would face whatever came next. Together, the morning air was crisp, carrying with it the scent of freshly turned soil and blooming flowers. The sun crested over the horizon, casting a warm golden light across the Parker estate. For the first time in decades, George Parker felt like the sunrise held promise instead of regret. He stood at the edge of the garden, watching Jonathan kneel beside a row of young saplings. His son, handled each plant with careful precision, his fingers gently patting down the soil. There was a quiet grace in his movements, a reflection of the strength and resilience he had carried through his fragmented life. George inhaled deeply, letting the moment wash over him. The heaviness of the past hadn't vanished, but it felt lighter, like a burden he could finally bear. Jonathan straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans. He turned and caught George's gaze, a smile softening his features. These should take root well here. The light's just right. George nodded, his voice warm. You have an eye for it, just like your mother. Jonathan's smile faltered slightly, but the sadness that lingered in his eyes was no longer overwhelming. He stepped closer, brushing his hands together. Do you really think we'll find her? George's chest tightened around the delicate hope that had been growing there. The folder Harrington had delivered a few days ago sat on his desk, its contents hinting at the possibility that Natalie was still alive. They hadn't found her yet, but for the first time, there was a path to follow. I do, George said firmly, and if she's out there, we'll bring her home. Jonathan nodded, his eyes clear and determined. I want to be part of that. I want to help. George placed a hand on his shoulder, pride swelling in his chest. We'll do it together. A comfortable silence settled between them, the warmth of the morning sun soaking into their bones. The past wasn't forgotten, but it no longer loomed over them like an unrelenting storm. They had survived it, and now they were moving forward. Jonathan looked around the garden, his gaze thoughtful. This place feels different now, like it's waking up. George smiled. I think we're all waking up. They turned toward the house, its windows glinting in the sunlight. The grand old building, once a monument to grief, now seemed to stand taller, brighter. It was still a place filled with memories. But now those memories felt like stepping stones instead of shackles. As they walked back toward the house, a figure appeared at the edge of the driveway. George's heart skipped a beat as he recognized Paul Harrington's steady stride. The investigator carried an air of quiet urgency, his eyes fixed on George and Jonathan. George's stomach twisted with anticipation. He glanced at Jonathan, who nodded, his jaw set. Harrington stopped in front of them, his expression serious but tinged with something that looked like hope. We found her. The words hit George like a bolt of lightning, his breath caught, his vision blurring. You found Natalie? Harrington nodded. She's alive. It wasn't easy tracking her down. She's been living in a remote town in Maine. She has no memory of the past, but she's safe. George's knees threatened to buckle. Jonathan grabbed his arm, steadying him. Tears welled in George's eyes, the world tilting under the weight of the revelation. She's alive, George whispered, the words barely audible. After all this time, Jonathan's voice was trembling. Can we see her? Harrington smiled softly. I've made arrangements. You can leave today. George looked at his son, the tears streaming down his face mirrored by the tears in Jonathan's eyes. They were tears of relief, of disbelief, of a hope that had finally come true. We're bringing her home, George said, his voice thick. We're a family again. Jonathan's hand tightened around George's arm. Let's go. The trip to Maine was a blur. The miles passed beneath them, each one carrying them closer to a reunion that felt like a miracle. They barely spoke, both lost in their thoughts, their hopes, their fears, but their hands remained steady, their resolve unwavering as they pulled into the small coastal town. The air smelled of salt and pine. Harrington led them to a modest white cottage nestled among tall trees. The sight of it sent a jolt through George's heart. He stepped out of the car, his legs feeling unsteady. Jonathan was right beside him, his presence a grounding force. The door to the cottage opened, and there she was, Natalie. She stood in the doorway, her hair longer and streaked with silver, her eyes wide and uncertain. The years had etched themselves onto her face. But to George, she was as beautiful as ever. A gasp escaped him, his heart pounding in his chest. "Natalie," he whispered, her brow furrowed, confusion clouding her features. "Do I know you?" The pain of her words was sharp, but George stepped forward, his voice trembling. "It's me, George, and this is Joshua, your son." Jonathan took a shaky step forward, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Mom," he choked out. Something flickered in her eyes. A spark, a glimmer of recognition. Her gaze darted between them, her breath quickening. Then, as if a dam had broken, tears filled her eyes. "George, Joshua," her voice cracked, the name falling from her lips like a prayer. And then she was running toward them, her arms outstretched. George caught her, pulling her close as sobs racked their bodies. Jonathan wrapped his arms around them both, the three of them clinging to each other, their tears mingling. Time stood still, the world narrowing to this one moment. A family, broken and lost for so long, finally finding their way back to each other, after what felt like forever. Natalie pulled back just enough to look into their faces. Her fingers traced the lines of George's face, then Jonathan's. "You came for me," she whispered. "We never stopped," George replied, his voice thick with emotion. Jonathan smiled through his tears. "We're together now. That's all that matters." As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, the sun broke through the clouds, bathing them in light. The past had tried to tear them apart, but love had brought them back together. They were whole again, and as they walked toward the cottage, hand in hand, they knew that this was only the beginning.